Hi, and welcome to my Festive Tech Calendar session 2024. In today's session, I'm going to show you how we can create a personalized year in review video generator. But before we get started, let me introduce myself. My name is John Kilmister, and I've been a software engineer and architect for many years now. You can find me on social media at John Kilmister, and I also have a blog at blueboxes.co.uk where I talk about Azure and software engineering. So when I started this project, I came up with my initial idea and thoughts, and I wanted to use the festive tech calendar to do something a bit different, a bit creative, and pull together a range of technologies that I didn't necessarily have day-to-day usage of. So what was that initial idea? Well, I took inspiration from things that were already out there. And at the end of every year, I'm often sent links to generate videos of my personal information. So, like, for example, in Strava, it shows me how I've done in my fitness goals throughout the year, or Duolingo, or equally YouTube Music. And these all share one thing in common: they're statistics driven and they've got engaging videos and animations. And that's what I thought I could build. Take inspiration from this and see if I could use my own data to build something new. As I use Azure every day, I thought it would be interesting to pull statistics from Azure and use them to create an animated video. Now, don't worry if you don't use Azure, because we can still use this same process that I'm going to talk about to use your own data from whatever source you want to create an engaging video. The first step was to think of the individual parts of this process. First off, we needed to gather the data, because if we don't have the data, we don't have a video. When we gather that data, I wanted to export it to a file. And the reason for that was that we could then later use that file in the second part of the process. But by splitting it into two parts, where we gather the data into a file and then we generate the video, it would allow me to review the data beforehand and swap it out for other data sources if needed. So as we've generated the file, then we want to create a template. Now the template is an important part because I could just go off and create a custom animation with my personal data, but I want to build a generator, something that will work on the command line that we can type in, and it will then fetch our data and generate us this video. And as part of that, I'm going to need to create a template in which to merge my data with. And the final step will be taking this merged template and actually exporting it as a video that we can watch. And ideally want this video to be in portrait format so that it can be viewed on mobile phone, on YouTube Shorts, and other social media. That's the plan. So let's have a look at how I went about implementing it. So I knew I wanted to get the data from Azure. I didn't really know what data I was going to get, so I started thinking about the different types of information that might be available to me. The key thing is I wanted this data to encompass the whole of 2024. The first thing I thought of was Azure metrics. And Azure metrics are great. They can give you numerical data about your individual resources. But there were two problems that I had with this. The first one is that the metrics are bespoke for each service. So I would have to create different scripts to interrogate different services. The other problem with it is the data doesn't go back far enough. I'm looking for 12 months worth of data, and by default, Azure Metrics will only go back a number of months. The second option was Azure Resource Graph. This is something I use all the time, and you can use KQL, a SQL-like syntax, to query all of the resources that you have in Azure. Find out how many virtual machines you have, find out what sort of app service plans you might be using, what scale they're at. But again, the problem with this is that the data is point in time. When you run the query, it's going to give you the data as it is now and not a historic view. This finally led me to Azure Billing. And Azure Billing will give you a historic view of everything that you've been charged for. And we can see this in the UI. We can see here that it gives us our service names, it gives us our locations, our resource groups, and along with how much that we've spent. And this could be really useful to turn into some summarized data to put into an animated video. But how do we get that data? Well, we could go into the Azure portal and download the information. But the challenge with that is that it introduces a manual process. And I'm really keen to be able to generate this video on the command line. The second option is to use the Azure REST API. And this is really good. It covers everything in the Azure portal, plus a load of extra things. But we do have to manage the HTTP requests ourselves and pass in the correct auth tokens. The better solution is to use either the Azure CLI or the AZ PowerShell commands. And that's what I did. I decided that I'd write a PowerShell script in order to automate the process, and I'd use the AZ PowerShell commands to implement that. The main one that I used was the AZ cost management export. It's a little bit complicated to use, but it does give you an export of all of your costs for a given time period. The first thing you have to do is create a cost export. This in itself doesn't do very much. It's just a definition of what is going to be done. Once that's done, you then run that cost report and it will export the data into a nominated Azure Blob Storage account. Once the data is in that Blob Storage account, we will download the file. Now we actually have to repeat this step of generating a cost report, running it and downloading the file for each quarter of the year. And the reason for that is that the cost export will only span a maximum of 4 months. And once we've downloaded all the files, we then have to combine them together. And this combined file will give us all our information for the entire year. We can finally extract the statistics that we want, summarizing the information, to put into a file which we can then later merge in with the template. So how are we going to do that? Well, the first thing, as I mentioned, is to call AZ Cost Management Export. And we can see here that we get a name, we specify that we want the usage, and the next bit is the scope of where we want that usage from. So I've gone with an individual subscription. Following this, we have the location that we're going to export this data to, and then the time period that we want it from and to. And as you can see there, I'm passing in the quarter start and end time because we can only span a maximum of 4 months with a daily granularity. Finally, we have the format, which is CSV, and that is unfortunately the only format we can use, but we're able to work with CSV quite easily inside PowerShell. Now, running this will only generate the export. It doesn't actually run the export and give us the data. In order to do that, we need to invoke the AZ cost management execute export command, passing back in the name and the scope again. And that will then actually run it and put the file in blob storage. As I said, we need to do this 4 times, once for each quarter. Once we've done that, you'll actually be able to see those exports sat there in the cost management export panel. They're the ones that are sat there waiting to be run, and when they're run, we'll actually generate the files. So we've kicked off the process to go and generate the files, and that takes a little bit of time. So in the PowerShell script, what we'll do is we will go and get all of the blobs that are in that storage container. If we haven't got 4 blobs, 1 for each quarter, then we will wait and we will try again. Otherwise, we'll leave the retry loop because all the blobs are available. Once we've downloaded the blobs, we can then read each of the CSV files. And in PowerShell, we can use the import CSV command in order to merge each of those 4 files into a single array. When we've got the data in the array, we can then use the measure object and unique in order to get some statistics out. For this simple sample, I've decided just to pull 3 bits of data out. The total number of resource groups for the year, the total number of resources for the year, and the total number of consumed services for the year. So once I've pulled those out with the summarized data, we'll then just save it to a JSON file, which we can then use for the second part of the project, which is merging the data source with the final template. So let's think about how we're going to generate this template, this animation. Well, my first thought was potentially to use something like Blender. Now, if you haven't heard of Blender, Blender is a 3D animation software, and you can create a lot of different types of 2D and 3D animation in it. Anything from full-length movies to simple guides. I've used it before to create this simple animation that I used when I was explaining how to build a little light cube that I was creating. Blender also supports merging in data from an external source, so that gets that covered. But the problem is, it can be complex to create these initial animations. And secondly, these animations can take hours or sometimes even days to render, which is really not something that I wanted. So I started thinking about other options other than Blender. One that I'd seen used is something called Lottie files. Now, Lottie files are a bit like SVGs, but you can use them to create animations. And we tend to use them in mobile apps or on websites. There are many that you can just go and download, but you can also create your own. That said, I couldn't work out how to merge in my data file into these Lottie animations. And it wasn't something that I'd heavily used before. So instead, I looked at the other options. And the option that I ended up going with was PowerPoint. Now, PowerPoint might not seem like an obvious choice at first. However, you can export PowerPoint to an MP4 video. And it has a rich set of animations, from the transitions between the individual pages to the actual on-page animations for moving items around. So this is what I went with, and I think the result actually looks quite good. But in order for this to work, I needed to be able to automate PowerPoint. I couldn't just rely on going into PowerPoint and doing an export. I needed a way of being able to achieve my goal of running this from the command line. Luckily, we can use, on a Windows system, COM to interact with PowerPoint. And I did this through a Python script. So we can pull in the Win32com package, and from that we can attach to PowerPoint. We can open our PowerPoint and specify that we don't want it to actually show to the user. So we can put with window false. Now, when working in this way, we do find that we have to occasionally just sleep our program and wait for things to finish. And that's what we're having to do here. We have to just wait and make sure that that presentation has actually opened. But then we can call the create video method. And these methods are all documented on the Microsoft website. And you can use them no matter what programming language you're using. So we call create video, and that has kicked off the process to create the video, or at least it will do. So we have to wait again, just briefly, to make sure that that command has been successfully received and that the video has started to be created. But the video creation itself takes a little while. So what we'll do is we can check the video status. 1 means in progress, so we'll keep looping while it's in progress. If it is still 1, then we're going to just print out that we're still waiting and give it a small sleep. Once it's no longer 1, we know that the video has finished. So we can say if the status is 0, it's been successful. Otherwise, we'll print a message to say that for some reason it wasn't. And finally, we just need to close the presentation and quit the application. So I use this to create my very first video from PowerPoint through Python. And it was a really simple video that just went from one slide to the next to the next. And that was great to prove that it worked. The next stage was to actually see if I could replace text in that PowerPoint presentation. And I was hoping, as this was a Microsoft product, we'd have some sort of mail merge feature, but that wasn't available. We did, however, have a find and replace. So I decided that with square brackets, I'd create some replacement tokens. I could then go back to the Python and work out if I could replace the content. And that's what I did. I created some hard-coded replacements here, just in a dictionary. You can see here just some random data. I could then loop through each slide and each shape and each text frame and eventually find the text to actually do a replacement on. And this worked really well. It took a little while to work out how to do this, and if we group the items in PowerPoint, then they end up inside a group, so it didn't quite work. But with some trial and error, we got there. So now we have the data and we have a basic concept for how we can get that merged into a template. The first thing I wanted to do was make it in a portrait orientation. And this is something, obviously, it's not natural to do with a PowerPoint presentation. But if we go to the Design tab and we go across the slide size, we can put in custom dimensions. Once we've got that, we can then go on and create each of the slides as we need to. As you can see here, I created just a simple 12 slides, and you can see each slide has a timer on it, so it will automatically transition from one slide to the next. I also added different animations on each of the slides. The most useful animation is the morph transition. So if an object exists in both slides, but is at a different size or shape, and you morph between it, it will then animate from the one to the other. I use that quite heavily in this. So they're the 3 core parts: gathering the data, working out how we're going to automate generating the video, and then creating an attractive looking template. So let's see what the result looked like. So I was really pleased with the result. There was lots of trial and error as I went through it, and I learned lots of different things. But I think we could use this technique for many different applications. Now, if you are interested in the full code, it is available on my GitHub. Many of the code samples that we've gone through in the slides have been truncated for brevity and to fit on the screen. But you can pull down this repo and create your own video. Now, just before we finish, I did want to shout out that this is part of the Festive Tech Calendar, and they are doing a fundraiser this year. So if you feel you're able to, please do visit the Just Giving page to donate. And that just leaves me to say thank you for listening and have a Merry Christmas.